Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools I use, and justify the time that I use on it thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So if you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and you have the means to help me to keep it going, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're willing and interested. And if monthly seems like a big ask, you can, of course, make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. And I would like to shout out a couple of folks who have contributed to the website recently. Thank you to both Jennifer and Catherine for your generosity, and it's very much appreciated. And if you'd like to help out Sleepy Time Tales without having to do so financially, you can simply spread the word, whether in person or on social media. If you think people will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just let them know. And that's enough of that. Return to the rather dry mechanism of evolution with Charles Darwin. Return this week to On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. And we pick up talking about natural selection itself. Extinction. This subject will be more fully discussed in our chapter on geology, but it must be here alluded to from being intimately connected with natural selection. Natural selection acts solely through the preservation of variations in some way advantageous, which consequently endure. But as from the high geometrical powers of increase of all organic beings, each area is already fully stocked with inhabitants, it follows that each selected and favored form increases in number, so will the less favored forms decrease and become rare. Rarity, as geology tells us, is the precursor to extinction. We can also see that any form represented by few individuals will, during fluctuations in the seasons or in the number of its enemies, run a good chance of utter extinction. But we may go further than this, for as new forms are continually and slowly being produced, unless we believe that the number of specific forms goes on perpetually and almost indefinitely increasing, numbers invariably must become extinct. That the number of specific forms has not indefinitely increased, geology shows us plainly, and indeed we can see reason why they should not have thus increased, for the number of places in the polity of nature is not indefinitely great. Not that we have any means of knowing that any one region has as yet got its maximum of species. Probably no region is as yet fully stocked, for at the Cape of Good Hope there are more species of plants are crowded together than in any other quarter of the world. Some foreign plants have become naturalized without causing, as far as we know, the extinction of any natives. Furthermore, the species which are most numerous in individuals will have the best chance of producing, within any given period, favorable variations. We have evidence of this in the facts given in the second chapter, showing that it is the common species which afford the greatest number of recorded varieties, or incipient species. Hence, rare species will be quickly modified or improved within any given period, and they will consequently be beaten in the race for life by the modified descendants of the commoner species. From these several considerations, I think it inevitably follows that as new species in the course of time are formed through natural selection, others will become rarer and rarer, and finally extinct. The forms which stand in closest competition with those undergoing modification and improvement will naturally suffer most. And we have seen in the chapter on the struggle for existence that it is the most closely allied forms, varieties of the same species and species of the same genus or related genera, which from having nearly the same structure, constitution, and habits, generally come into the severest competition with each other. Consequently, each new variety or species during the progress of its formation will generally press hardest on the nearest kindred and tend to exterminate them. We see the same process of extermination amongst our domesticated productions through the selection of improved forms by man. Many curious instances could be given showing how quickly new breeds of cattle, sheep, and other animals, and variety of flowers, take the place of older and inferior kinds. In Yorkshire, it is historically known that the ancient black cattle were displaced by the longhorns, and that these were swept away by the shorthorns. I quote the words of an agricultural writer, as if by some murderous pestilence. Divergence of character. The principle which I have designated by this term is of high importance on my theory, and explains, as I believe, several important facts. In the first place, varieties, even strongly marked ones, though having somewhat of the character of species, as is shown by the hopeless doubts in many cases how to rank them, yet certainly differ from each other far less than do good and distinct species. Nevertheless, according to my view, varieties of species in the process of formation are, as I have called them, incipient species. How then does the lesser difference between varieties become augmented into the greater difference between species? That this does habitually happen, we must infer from most of the innumerable species throughout nature, presenting well-marked differences. Whereas varieties, the supposed prototypes and parents of future well-marked species, present slight and ill-defined differences. Mere chance, as we may call it, might cause one variety to differ in some character from its parents, and the offspring of this variety again to differ from its parent in the very same character, and in a greater degree. But this alone would never account for so habitual and large an amount of difference as that between varieties of the same species and species of the same genus. As has always been my practice, let us seek light in this head from our domestic productions. We shall here find something analogous. A fancier is struck by a pigeon having a slightly shorter beak. Another fancier is struck by a pigeon having a rather longer beak. And on the acknowledged principle that fanciers do not, and will not, admire a medium standard, but like extremes, they both will go on, as has actually occurred with tumbler pigeons, choosing and breeding from birds with longer and longer beaks, or shorter and shorter beaks. Again, we may suppose that an early period of one man preferred swifter horses, another stronger and more bulky. The early differences would be very slight. In the course of time, from the continued selection of swifter horses by some breeders, and of stronger ones by others, the differences would become greater, and would be noted as forming two subbreeds. Finally, after the lapse of centuries, the subbreeds would become converted into two well-established and distinct breeds. As the differences slowly become greater, the inferior animals with intermediate characters, being neither very swift nor very strong, will have been neglected and will have tended to disappear. Here then we see in man's productions the action of what may be called the principle of divergence, causing differences, at first barely appreciable, steadily to increase, and the breeds to diverge in character both from each other and from their common parent. But how, it may be asked, can any analogous principle apply in nature? I believe it can and does apply most efficiently, from the simple circumstance that the more diversified the descendants from any one species become in structure, constitution, and habits, by so much will they be better enabled to seize on many and widely diversified places in the polity of nature, and so be enabled to increase in numbers. We can clearly see this in the case of animals with simple habits. Take the case of a carnivorous quadruped, of which the number that can be supported in any country has long ago arrived at its full average. If its natural powers of increase be allowed to act, it can succeed in increasing, the country not undergoing any change in its conditions, only by its varying descendants seizing on places at present occupied by other animals. Some of them, for instance, being enabled to feed on new kinds of prey, either dead or alive. Some inhabiting new stations, climbing trees, frequenting water, and some perhaps becoming less carnivorous. The more diversified in habits and structure the descendants of our carnivorous animal became, the more places they would be enabled to occupy. What applies to one animal will apply throughout all time to all animals. That is, if they vary, for otherwise natural selection can do nothing. So it will be with plants. It has been experimentally proved that if a plot of ground be sown with one species of grass, and a similar plot be sown with several distinct genera of grasses, a greater number of plants and a greater weight of dry herbage can thus be raised. The same has been found to hold good when first one variety and then several mixed varieties of wheat have been sown on equal spaces of ground. Hence, if any one species of grass were to go on varying, and those varieties were continually selected, which differed from each other in all the same manner as distinct species and genera of grasses differ from each other, a greater number of individual plants of this species of grass, including its modified descendants, would succeed in living on the same piece of ground. And we well know that each species and each variety of grass is annually sowing almost countless seeds, and thus, as it may be said, striving its utmost to increase its numbers. Consequently, I cannot doubt that in the course of many thousands of generations, the most distinct varieties of any one species of grass would always have the best chance of succeeding, and of increasing in numbers, and thus of supplanting the less distinct varieties, and varieties, when rendered very distinct from each other, can take the rank of species. The truth of the principle, that the greatest amount of life can be supported by great diversification of structure, is seen under many natural circumstances. In an extremely small area, especially if freely open to immigration, and where the contest between individual and individual must be severe, we always find great diversity in its inhabitants. For instance, I found that a piece of turf 3 feet by 4 in size, which had been exposed for many years to exactly the same conditions, supported 20 species of plants, and these belonged to 18 genera and to 8 orders, which shows how much these plants differed from each other. So it is with the plants and insects on small and uniform islets, and so in small ponds of fresh water. Farmers find that they can raise most food by a rotation of plants belonging to the most different orders. Nature follows what may be called a simultaneous rotation. Most of the animals and plants which live close round any small piece of ground could live on it, supposing it not be in any way peculiar in its nature. and may be said to be striving to the utmost to live there. But it is seen that where they come into the closest competition with each other, the advantages of diversification of structure, with the accompanying differences of habit and constitution, determine that the inhabitants, which thus jostle each other most closely, shall, as a general rule, belong to what we call different genera and orders. The same principle is seen in the naturalization of plants through man's agency in foreign lands. It might have been expected that the plants which have succeeded in becoming naturalized in any land would generally have been closely allied to the indigenes, for these are commonly looked at as specially created and adapted for their own country. It might also perhaps have been expected that naturalized plants would have belonged to a few groups more especially adapted to certain stations in their new homes. But the case is very different. And de Candolle has well remarked in his great and admirable work that flora is gained by naturalization proportionally with the number of the native genera and species, far more in new genera than in new species. To give a single instinct, in the last edition of Dr. Asa Gray's Manual of the Flora of the Northern United States, 260 naturalized plants are enumerated, and these belong to 162 genera. We thus see that the naturalized plants are of a highly diversified nature. They differ, moreover, to a large extent from the indigenes, for out of the 162 genera, no less than 100 genera are not their indigenous, and thus a large proportion, in addition, is made to the genera of the states. By considering the nature of the plants or animals which have struggled successfully with the indigenes of any country, and have there become naturalized, we can gain some crude idea in which manner some of the natives would have had to be modified in order to have gained an advantage over the other natives. And we may, I think, at least safely infer that diversification of structure amounting to generic differences would have been profitable to them. The advantage of diversification in the inhabitants of the same region is in fact the same as that of the physiological division of labor in the organs of the same individual body, a subject so well elucidated by Milne Edwards. No physiologist doubts that a stomach, by being adapted to digest vegetable matter alone, or flesh alone, draws most nutriment from these substances. So in the general economy of any land, the more widely and perfectly the animals and plants are diversified for different habits of life, so will a greater number of individuals be capable of their supporting themselves. A set of animals with their organization but little diversified could hardly compete with a set of more perfectly diversified in structure. It may be doubted, for instance, whether the Australian marsupials, which are divided into groups differing but little from each other, and feebly representing, as most of the Waterhouse and others have remarked, are carnivorous, ruminant, and rodent mammals, could successfully compete with these well-pronounced orders. In the Australian mammals, we see the process of diversification in an early and incomplete stage of development. After the foregoing discussion, which ought to have been much amplified, we may, I think, assume that the modified descendants of any one species will succeed by so much the better as they become more diversified in structure, and are thus enabled to encroach on places occupied by other beings. Now let us see how this principle of great benefit, being derived from divergence of character, combined with the principles of natural selection and of extinction, will tend to act. The accompanying diagram will aid us in understanding this rather perplexing subject. Let A to L represent the species of a genus large in its own country. These species are supposed to resemble each other in unequal degrees, as is so generally the case in nature, and as is represented in the diagram by the letters standing at unequal distances. I have said a large genus because we have seen in the second chapter that on average more of the species of large genera vary than of small genera, and the varying species of the large genera present a greater number of varieties. We have also seen that the species, which are the commonest and most widely diffused, vary more than rare species with restricted ranges. Let A be a common, widely diffused and varying species belonging to a genus large in its own country. The little fan of diverging dotted lines of unequal lengths proceeding from A may represent its varying offspring. The variations are supposed to be extremely slight, but of the most diversified nature. They are not supposed all to appear simultaneously, but often after long intervals of time. Nor are they all supposed to endure for equal periods. Only those variations which are in some way profitable will be well preserved or naturally selected. And here the importance of the principle of benefit being derived from divergence of character comes in. For this will generally lead to the most different or divergent variations, represented by the outer dotted lines, being preserved and accumulated by natural selection. When a dotted line reaches one of the horizontal lines and is there marked by a small numbered letter, a sufficient amount of variation is supposed to have been accumulated to have formed a fairly well-marked variety, such as would be thought worthy of record in a systemic work. The intervals between the horizontal lines in the diagram may represent each 1,000 generations, but would have been better if each had represented 10,000 generations. After 1,000 generations, species A is supposed to have produced two fairly well-marked varieties, namely A1 and M1. These two varieties will generally continue to be exposed to the same conditions which made the parents variable, and the tendency to variability is in itself hereditary. Consequently, they will tend to vary, and generally to vary in nearly the same manner as their parents varied. Moreover, these two varieties, being only slightly modified forms, will tend to inherit those advantages which made their common parent, A, more numerous than most of the other inhabitants of the same country. They will likewise partake of the more general advantages which being made the genus to which the parent species belonged, a large genus in its own country. And these circumstances we know to be favorable to the production of new species. If then these two varieties be variable, the most divergent of their variation will generally be preserved during the next 1,000 generations. And after this interval, variety A1 is supposed in the diagram to produce variety A2, which will, owing to the principle of divergence, differ more from A than did variety A1. Variety M1 is supposed to produce two varieties, namely M2 and S2, differing from each other and more considerably from their common parent A. We may continue the process by similar steps for any length of time. Some of the varieties after each 1,000 generations producing only a single variety, but in a more and more modified condition. Some producing two or three varieties and some failing to produce any. Thus the varieties or modified descendants proceeding from the common parent, A, will generally go on increasing in number and diverging in character. In the diagram, the process is represented up to the 10,000th generation, and under a condensed and simplified form up to the 14,000th generation. But I must here remark that I do not suppose that the process ever goes on so regularly as is represented in the diagram, though itself made somewhat irregular. I am far from thinking that the most divergent varieties will invariably prevail and multiply. A medium form may often long endure, and may or may not produce more than one modified descendant. For natural selection will always act according to the nature of the places which are either unoccupied or not perfectly occupied by other beings, and this will depend on infinitely complex relations. But as a general rule, the more diversified in structure the descendants from any one species can be rendered, the more places they will be enabled to seize on, and the more their modified progeny will be increased. In our diagram, the line of succession is broken at regular intervals by small numbered letters, marking the successive forms, which have become sufficiently distinct to be recorded as varieties. But these breaks are imaginary and might have been inserted anywhere, after intervals long enough to have allowed the accumulation of a considerable amount of divergent variation. As all the modified descendants from a common and widely diffused species belonging to a large genus will tend to partake of the same advantages which have made their parents successful in life, they will generally go on multiplying in number, as well as diverging in character. This is represented in the diagram by the several divergent branches proceeding from A. The modified offspring from the later and more highly improved branches in the lines of descent will, it is probable, often take the place of, and so destroy, the earlier and less improved branches. This is represented in the diagram by some of the lower branches not reaching to the upper horizontal lines. In some cases, I do not doubt that the process of modification will be confined to a single line of descent, and the number of the descendants will not be increased, although the amount of divergent modification may be increased in the successive generations. This case would be represented in the diagram if all the lines proceeding from A were removed, excepting that from A1 to A10. In the same way, for instance, the English racehorse and English pointer have apparently both gone on slowly diverging in character from their original stocks, without either having given off any fresh branches or races. After 10,000 generations, species A is supposed to have produced three forms, A10, F10, and M10, which, from having diverged in character during the successive generations, will have come to differ largely, but perhaps unequally from each other, and from their common parent. If we suppose the amount of change between each horizontal line in our diagram to be excessively small, these three forms may still be only well-marked varieties, or they may have arrived at the doubtful category of subspecies. But we have only to suppose the steps in the process of modification to be more numerous or greater in amount, to convert these three forms into well-defined species. Thus, the diagram illustrates the steps by which the small differences distinguishing varieties are increased into the larger differences distinguishing species. By continuing the same process for a greater number of generations, as shown in the diagram in a condensed and simplified manner, we get 8 species, marked by the letters between A14 and M14, all descended from A. Thus, as I believe, species are multiplied and genera are formed. In a large genus, it is probable that more than one species would vary. In the diagram, I have assumed that a second species, I, has produced by analogous steps, after 10,000 generations, either two well-marked varieties, W10 and Z10, or two species, according to the amount of change supposed to be represented between the horizontal lines. After 14,000 generations, 6 new species, marked by the letters N14 to Z14, are supposed to have been produced. In each genus, the species, which are already extremely different in character, will generally tend to produce the greatest number of modified descendants, for these will have the best chance of filling new and widely different places in the polity of nature. Hence, in the diagram, I have chosen the extreme species, A, and the nearly extreme species, I, as those which have largely varied, and have given rise to new varieties and species. The other 9 species, marked by capital letters of our original genus, may for a long period continue transmitting unaltered descendants, and this is shown in the diagram by the dotted lines not prolonged far upward from want of space. But during the process of modification represented in the diagram, another of our principles, namely that of extinction, will have played an important part. As in each fully stocked country, natural selection necessarily acts by the selected form having some advantage in the struggle for life over other forms. There will be a constant tendency in the improved descendants of any one species to supplant and exterminate in each stage of descent their predecessors and their original parent. For it should be remembered that the competition will generally be most severe between those forms, which are most nearly related to each other in habits, constitution, and structure. Hence all the intermediate forms between the earlier and later states, that is, between the less and more improved state of a species, as well as the original parent species itself, will generally tend to become extinct. So it probably will be with many whole collateral lines of descent, which will be conquered by later and improved lines of descent. If, however, the modified offspring of a species get into some distinct country, or become quickly adapted to some new station, in which child and parent do not come into competition, both may continue to exist. If then our diagram be assumed to represent a considerable amount of modification, species A and all the earlier varieties will have become extinct, having been replaced by 8 new species, A14 to M14, and R will have been replaced by 6, N14 to Z14, new species. But we may go further than this. The original species of our genus were supposed to resemble each other in unequal degrees, as is so generally the case in nature. Species A being more nearly related to B, C, and D than to the other species, and species I more to G, H, K, L than to the others. These two species, A and I, were also supposed to be very common and widely diffused species, so they must originally have had some advantage over most of the other species of the genus. Their modified descendants, 14 in number at the 14,000th generation, will probably have inherited some of the same advantages. They have also been modified and improved in a diversified manner at each stage of descent, so as to become adapted to many related places in the natural economy of their country. It seems, therefore, to me extremely probable that they will have taken the places of, and thus exterminated, not only their parents, A and I, but likewise some of the original species which were most nearly related to their parents. Hence, very few of the original species will have transmitted offspring to the 14,000th generation. We may suppose that only one, F, of the two species, which were least closely related to the other 9 original species, has transmitted descendants to this late stage of descent. The new species on our diagram descended from the original 11 species, will now be 15 in number. Owing to the divergent tendency of natural selection, the extreme amount of difference in character between species A14 and Z14 will be much greater than that between the most different of the original 11 species. The new species, moreover, will be allied to each other in a widely different manner. Of their descendants from A, the 3 marked A14, Q14, P14 will be nearly related from having recently branched off, from A10, B14, and F14, from having diverged at an earlier period from A5, will be in some degree distinct from the 3 first-named species. And lastly, O14, E4, and M14 will be nearly related one to the other, but from having diverged at the first commencement of the process of modification, will be widely different from the other 5 species, and may constitute a subgenus or even a distinct genus. The 6 descendants from I will form 2 subgenera, or even genera. But as the original species I differed largely from A, standing nearly at their extreme points of the original genus, the 6 descendants from I will, owing to inheritance, differ considerably from the 8 descendants from A. The 2 groups, moreover, are supposed to have gone on diverging in different directions. The intermediate species, also, and this is a very important consideration, which connected the original species A and I, have all become, excepting F, extinct, and have left no descendants. Hence, the 6 new species descended from I and the 8 descended from A will have to be ranked as very distinct genera, or even as distinct subfamilies. Thus it is, as I believe, that two or more genera are produced by descent, with modification, from two or more species of the same genus. And the two or more parent species we are supposed to have descended from some one species of an earlier genus. In a diagram, this is indicated by the broken lines beneath the capital letters, converging in sub-branches downwards towards a single point. This point representing a single species, the supposed single parent of our several new subgenera and genera. It is worthwhile to reflect for a moment on the character of the new species F14, which is supposed not to have diverged much in character, but to retain the form of F, either unaltered or altered only in a slight degree. In this case, its affinities to the other 14 new species will be of a curious and circuitous nature. Having descended from a form which stood between the two parent species, A and I, now supposed to be extinct and unknown, it will be in some degree intermediate in character between the two groups descended from these species. But as these groups have gone on diverging in character from the type of their parents, the new species, F14, will not be directly intermediate between them, but rather between types of the two groups, and every naturalist will be able to bring some such case before his mind. In the diagram, each horizontal line has hitherto been supposed to represent 1,000 generations, but each may represent 1,000,000 or 100,000,000 generations, and likewise a section of the successive strata of the Earth's crust, including extinct remains. We shall, when we come to our chapter on geology, have to refer again to this subject, and I think we shall then see that the diagram throws light on the affinities of extinct beings, which, though generally belonging in the same orders or families or genera with those now living, yet are often in some degree intermediate in character between the existing groups. And we can understand this fact, for the extinct species lived at very ancient epochs, when the branching lines of descent had diverged less. I see no reason to limit the process of modification, as now explained, to the formation of genera alone. If in our diagram we suppose the amount of change represented by each successive group of diverging dotted lines to be very great, the forms marked A14 to P14, those marked B14 and F14, and those marked O14 to M14, will form three very distinct genera. We shall also have two very distinct genera descended from I, and as these latter two genera, both from continued divergence of character, and from inheritance from a different parent, will differ widely from the three genera descended from A. The two little groups of genera will form two distinct families, or even orders, according to the amounts of divergent modification supposed to be represented in the diagram. And the two new families or orders will have descended from two species of the original genus, and these two species are supposed to have descended from one species of a still more ancient and unknown genus. And I think I'm going to leave it there. I'm barely staying awake to read this, so I'm sure there's no one listening right now. But if you are and you'd like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original, as always, on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.